Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works. All right, well, his biography of Neil Finn, no surprise, it's called Don't Dream It's Over. Jeff Apter joins me on the show to discuss it. Jeff, welcome.
It's great to be here, Michael. Thank you.
So was it an obvious choice that was the song that was going to be the title of the Neil Finn biography? Is it like almost like if you were doing a Bruce Springsteen one, it would have to be called Born in the USA?
Yeah, I guess so. Sometimes you've really, I've written 30 books. I've been doing this for a long time. And there was a period where I sort of prided myself on clever and, sort of esoteric titles. And then I realized, what am I doing? People are getting confused by this. Just come up with the obvious. And in this instance, it's such a universally known song too. And I guess it also, now that I think about it, it applies to Neil's career, which is, my God, it's almost 50 years down the line. So the idea of it ever being over is something of a dream. I think he's one of those guys who's going to be on stage until he just can't be on stage anymore. So it turned out to be kind of a fitting title.
So on that note, was there like any hesitation to doing a biography at this point, considering like this is a guy who's still going?
No, look, it was a series of circumstances for me. I'd written about Neil and Tim before. I'd written quite a bit about Neil and Crowded House and so on when I was working at Rolling Stone. It was simply a matter of an opportunity came up to do it. There was no real timing or anything that I was sort of linking it to. In fact, as it turned out, I picked the worst possible time to write the book because when I reached out to Neil to get some input, of course, he just decided to go and join Fleetwood Mac. So, so that kind of killed that. But, I did get some help by some people who are really close to Neil and the story and his life. So I was quite lucky in that regard. But yeah, it was kind of funny. The timing was just in some ways really bad, really, really bad. But, I thought I best let Neil go on this little adventure of his with Fleetwood Mac. I didn't want to spoil it for the man, so I decided to let him go. And as I found out, he's went off to earn staggering amounts of money and play to these incredible audiences, and really probably have the biggest tour of his life. So, I am but a humble author.
It also adds, an extra chapter for your book, right? Like kind of
Oh, sure.
I mean, not that he didn't have a lot of zigging and zagging throughout his musical career, but that's like one extra zag to include in the
But,
book.
but but an odd one. He's not
Yeah.
playing. I mean, with the exception of a couple of songs per night, he wasn't playing his own material, and it's the first time. Well, the first time since he joined Split Enz back in 1977 that he's not been out there playing his own songs, playing his own material. It must have been quite an unfamiliar sort of territory for him. Admittedly, the songs he was playing, that's not a bad set list. A Fleetwood Mac retrospective of the past 50 years of music. It's pretty exciting for anybody sort of operating in that realm to be able to play those songs. But yeah, it was a new sensation for him for sure. And he took it in good. I mean, he got a bit of criticism this side of the world for it. There was a bit of, it's like joining a covers band. What are you doing? You're an original artist. What are you going to do? Why are you going to play in someone else's band? But there was a lot more to it. Him and Mick Fleetwood were friends going back several years. I think their friendship was beyond music. They just got along really, really well. Mick was in New Zealand, I think, with Fleetwood Mac when they first met, and their relationship had continued from there. So there was a bit more. There was a personal factor to it as well. Neil made light of it. I think when it was announced, when the story broke, he released a tweet, and I think it said, "The mystery of Stonehenge has been solved. Oh, and by the way, I've joined Fleetwood Mac," which I thought was pretty good.
You mentioned that the first time hadn't done his own song since Split Enz in '77. That's kind of your first introduction to Neil and Split Enz, as you write, in the book that you chanced upon them. Like, had you gone
Um,
specifically to see Split Enz, or had you gone to see another band, or like how did
No,
you
no,
end up with that?
I knew a little bit about them. Just to set it up, it's 1979. It's I think I mentioned it was winter in Australia, but I'm talking to someone from Winnipeg for God's sake. Winter in Australia is sort of like summer anywhere else, but to me it was cold. I remember it being cold. It's probably 50 degrees or some horrible state like that. And it was a winter night. Split Enz at that point, they bounced around. They'd formed in 1972. Neil had joined in 1977. They'd spent most of their time in the UK, but they based themselves out of Melbourne in Australia, even though they're originally from New Zealand. They got a fair bit of exposure here on a TV show called Countdown. Countdown was a lot like in fact, it basically lifted all its ideas from a UK program called The Top of the Pops. I guess sort of an American Bandstand style program with, this big countdown. And they fitted the bill perfectly. It was essentially a video and live performance show. And here's a band, even in the 70s, that really were sort of ahead of their time when it came to their presentation. They dressed in these amazing bespoke suits. They had these punkish kind of mohawk haircuts, makeup piled on their face, and everything they did was very visual. They had a great, strong visual sense. I mean, they were art school students, for God's sake. So they'd had a couple of minor hits here in Australia. Icy Red was actually a bit of a mainstream breakthrough for them, but they hadn't yet really achieved anything like the success that was just around the corner when I saw this show. So it's 1979. As I learned later on, they were just about to go in and record I Got You and the album True Colours, which, was a big breakthrough for them, not just in Australia and New Zealand, but internationally. I think it was a particularly big hit in Canada from memory. And, so I saw them and I remember thinking, this feels like, and I was only 17 at the time. I snuck in, I was underage, and there was only maybe 100 people there. And I was at a disco, on the weekends. We're sort of at the end of the disco era. And this venue, most of the time, was a disco, and there's still a mirror ball, and there's still the flashing, dance floor, the LED dance floor and all that kind of stuff. When they came on, I remember thinking a couple of things. Firstly, you couldn't take your eyes off them. Neil was much younger than most of the other guys in the band. So, he was sort of the matinee idol, if you like, at the front of the band. But they were just really arresting visually. They were still wearing those bespoke suits. They were still, their haircuts, they'd sort of had modified mohawks, I guess, by this time, but they looked really at a united front on stage. And they were quite physical on stage too. I remember that really strongly, that they'd crash into each other and, really kind of laughingly, kind of foolishly push each other around on stage. But the songs, you could just tell, even though a lot of it was unfamiliar because they were working on new material, which eventually became True Colours, I just got a sense that there was something really about to happen with this band. I'm not sure if you've ever seen a show where you just felt something. You just walked away going, they're not big now, but I get a feeling that pretty soon something is really going to happen. And that's the sense I had. And within 6 months here in Australia, they were the biggest band in the country. Huge in New Zealand, and as I said, they had a big breakthrough in Canada, some success in the US, and I Got You was a top 10 single in the UK as well. So I just saw them at the right time. I was just really, really lucky, and I just remember, even now I can picture it in my mind. Oh, God, it's almost, was it 45, 47 years later? I can picture this show, and even though it was a small crowd, and there wasn't a great deal of audience engagement, the band seemed to be really heading in a specific and very clear direction, and it really left a lasting impression on me.
So that's obviously the start of your engagement with Neil and his music. What's the start of this book for you then? Like, at what point do you start thinking this is something I want to do?
Well, as I said, I wrote about Neil and Tim. I wrote a book called Together Alone maybe 10 years ago, and I wrote more. It was really more focused on their relationship in Split Ends, with some Crowded House and some solo stuff. But subsequent to that, of course, Neil's career had really blossomed. And just like I said before, just the opportunity just came up with my publisher just to do it. I pitched the idea to them. I think based on the simple fact there wasn't a book about Neil. No one had written a book. There'd been some Crowded House books, and some of the guys in Split Ends had written their own memoirs. But I thought it's a really good time to look back over that, like I say, almost 50-year span of this career. So that was really the primary motivation, nothing more. A bit of good fortune on my case that I had a publisher that was interested in doing it. And, I was able to take it from there. I guess that was, it was probably 2 or 3 years, the evolution of the actual book itself. But I had so much material to draw from already, from having seen Neil perform with Split Ends, with Crowded House as a solo artist in a whole variety of guises. Interviewed him a couple of times, spent a little bit of time in the studio with him around the time of Time on Earth, the Crowded House sort of comeback record. And locally, of course, Crowded House had performed what's still considered one of the biggest shows in music history here, when they said farewell the first time in 1996 at the Sydney Opera House. So there's so much to draw from. I was really quite fortunate in that regard. In some ways, I was really in the perfect place to write about a band like that or an artist like that, because I just had so much exposure to so many interesting aspects of Neil's career.
So you obviously like still had your notes from Together Alone and stuff then, like you were
Oh,
drawing on
sure. Yeah.
research from
Yeah, but I
that
made it.
phase.
Yeah, but I made it better.
Right. Well, I'm just curious in terms of like, because there's like a 5-page, resource list at the back of the book, right? Like all the, sources that you
Mm.
drew on. And I was curious, like it was all that some of that was not like whole cloth, like just for this book that you obviously had already done some of that, I'm guessing, for the prior book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was tempted just to, because what happened, without getting too boring, I'd got the rights back for that book. It'd done quite well locally. It had some UK distribution. It did quite well, but it sort of ran its course.
Hmm.
So clips that are timely. Sometimes they just run out of steam, and I got the rights back, and I was tinkering with the idea of really just updating it, just making it Together Alone again, but
Hmm.
then I thought, no, I really want to focus specifically, what can I do with this material that's new? So I basically just discarded 80% of that original work, although it was great for reference. A lot of that material, of course, was really handy because I was in effect telling that story again. But really, as it turned out, that book became a very, very small percentage of this. I really found myself writing significant, new material about the last 10 years of Neil's career, which to me are just as interesting as the first 20 or so, because, he's managed to find a way to, without being indulgent, to pursue things that seem quite unlikely, like, recording an entire album live in the studio with an orchestra and a choir, things like that. It wasn't a commercial record, but it was just a really interesting exercise in, I think it was called Out of Silence, to be able to do something so significant on the spot. I guess it was a personal challenge. So things like that really interested me, above and beyond, the obvious Crowded House hits, the dance hits, the well-known stuff. So it really gave me an opportunity to explore some of the slightly lesser known projects that he's been involved in.
For the older stuff that you'd already kind of done research on for the prior book, like now that because you do cite, podcasts and social media and other
Mm.
kind of sourcing, like was there like a plethora of new material for you to kind of like explore or, research to like fill out some of that earlier stuff?
Yeah, well, what was really interesting was Neil had done, quite recently, started a podcast called Fang Radio, Fang Radio, that he hosts. And he did a series where he basically broke down every Crowded House record. And he'd invite him to the studio. He'd have Nick Seymour on some sessions with him. He'd have Tim, his brother Tim, with him on other sessions. He'd have Mitchell Froome in, who, was his producer on the first couple of records, and then has more recently joined Crowded House. So he had a lot of really interesting. I mean, I have to be careful. Obviously, there's what they call here fair usage. You
Mhm.
can't just quote things verbatim. You have to use a bit of creative license, or a bit of, you just can't quote things endlessly, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
So, but it did give me, it gave me new insight, I guess, into areas that I'd covered in some detail before. And, sometimes I just got it wrong. A good example of that is, when the Crowded House, I think it was on the second album, they had a song called Into Temptation. And when it came out here, I remember very specifically everybody going, "Whoa, what's happening at Neil's house?" It was,
Mm.
is he in a romantic relationship with someone else? What's he admitting here? And we being music writers here, sort of bought into that, thinking, "Wow, that's a real confession." Is he telling us that, there's this marriage that we all know that's been, solid as a rock for many, many years, was in trouble. Then I found out through that podcast that the backstory was hilarious. I'd never heard this before, that he wrote the song after spending a night in a hotel by himself in a hotel room, but on either side of him, on one side was the local rugby team all sharing a room. On the other side was the local netball team who were all sharing a room. And all night long, all he could hear were people going from one room to another and making, various sounds, shall we say, during the course of the night. So he sort of wrote it from the perspective of someone else entirely. But I didn't know that. And I don't think a lot of people knew that. And when he revealed something like that, I thought that was just hilarious. It just shows how wrong music writers can sometimes be. And then, another good example of that is the song When You Come, which everybody here was thinking, well, it's just about an orgasm. What's he talking? But he said it was, he revealed during this podcast that it was really a comment on things like tsunamis and, natural phenomenon. And I have no reason to believe that he was tongue-in-cheek. And there was some very funny stuff. He had his son in the studio with him during that podcast, and his eldest son, Liam, and he said to him, "I'm really glad you said that, Dad, because I was never brave enough to ask you what that song was actually about." So, stuff like that it was fun to learn it. And it also, like I say, goes to prove that we music writers and journalists and critics sometimes just get it completely wrong.
I think that's the case with any piece of art, right? Like at a certain point, the author's intent is maybe lost to kind of like the audience's inference. And I have to imagine, like, you read about Tim's song 6 months in a leaky boat, that like he
Sure.
clearly was writing about something he was going through,
Yeah.
that like you can't always tell which ones are from the heart and which ones are from the head in some sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Tim, in his songwriting, has always been a bit more direct, perhaps, than Neil. Neil's been a bit elusive and elusive as well, I guess, with some of his songs, and then, subsequently has enjoyed telling people that they misinterpreted it. Tim tends to be a bit more. I guess Tim's more of a classic singer-songwriter, is that his songs are a bit more confessional. Dirty Creature is another good example of that, the Split Enz song. When those songs were written when Tim was going through, what was essentially a nervous breakdown, end of a relationship, solo career, various things happening in his life that were really weighing on him very heavily. And so, it's interesting that two brothers who brought up in a very similar musical environment and shared a lot had quite contrasting writing styles, particularly lyrical styles.
Did you ever put a finger on like why that would be? Like, is it just simply like attributable to age difference and a little bit of kind of like a gap there, or like just personality?
Yeah, I think it's just personality. I've spent, I don't, I only know them through work. I've only encountered them through my work, and Tim's quite a different character. He's a bit more extroverted than Neil. You see Tim on stage, particularly during the sort of halcyon days of Split Ends. He's larger than life. He's a big guy. Firstly, physically he's big, but he's got this very huge personality on stage. Whereas Neil, I think Neil would always have preferred to shut up and play his guitar, to quote Frank Zappa. I think he's a bit more, rather perform the songs and maybe give you a bit of banter between, whereas Tim was a lot more animated, has always been a lot more animated on stage. So yeah, they're markedly different type of characters. And the simple fact, Tim's gone into, more recently, he's working in film and theatre and musical theatre and so on here. So he's gone in quite a different direction to Neil. So that's interesting too, that whereas Neil's continued with Crowded House, joined Fleetwood Mac, done some interesting solo projects, but he's still pretty much kept within that pop rock kind of world. Tim's diversified quite radically in some ways.
Well, and I guess like Neil's focus has been, even when he does like diverse projects, it's on creative process in some ways. Like it's much more on the music rather than the performance of the music.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. The touring is sort of the after effect of making a record. I guess you look at something like Together Alone, which was the fourth, and at that time, final Crowded House record until they got back together many years later. That was a mammoth project, and a big musical statement. And there's a comment in the book, and I think it's really quite poignant, is that Nick Seymour was convinced that they'd done Together Alone, and it was a stepping stone to a really profound and important record, something that was going to be, really influential. And then Radiohead released OK Computer. And I think Nick called Neil Finn and said, that's the record we should have made. And I thought that was really interesting because if you listen to Together Alone, it's got elements of that. It's far different to that first Crowded House record, which was in parts quite bright and summery and heavy with really great pop songs, as well as Don't Dream It's Over, of course. But they got into far deeper territory with Together Alone. It's sort of to me, it's a sort of classic studio record of that time. And you wonder if they'd stayed together for a few more years after that, whether they would have been, competing with someone like Radiohead as being the influential band of the time. I really think they had the potential to do that.
Now, obviously, post Crowded House, or at least, that iteration of it, you were talking about, like being longtime friends with Mick Fleetwood. A lot of his like musical projects come out of friendship as like subsequent to that, right? Like the Seven Worlds Collide thing. Like
Yeah,
it's
sure.
all like he's befriended people while he's been on tour or been around the world or been in the studio and stuff like that. How much of this is attributed, like he's just like an open person when it comes to like creativity, or like what is it about him that you think like other artists gravitate and are like, sure, we'll come to New Zealand and
Well,
record with you?
yeah, well, there's that. I
I mean,
think he's
not
one of
that
the
like
best.
it's not, I'm not sure New Zealand's a hard sell to like come to the beach or whatever, but
Look, I think a number of things. He's very well respected, obviously, highly regarded by his peers. There's no doubt about that. But I think the impression I get, and again, I'm not using personal experience for this because my only involvement with him has been through work, but I get the impression he's just a good bloke. People just like him. Other musicians really like him. They like his work. They like the fact that he, if I can speak freely, is pretty much bullshit free. It's a typical trait of people from this end of the world. We tend to cut through the crap, and he's very much like that. While he's got this great artistic, creative talent, he's also a pretty regular guy. In fact, someone just sent me a video today of him playing. Yesterday, he was playing some songs down at a local markets, the local artisan markets. He just turned up with an acoustic guitar and played some songs. I don't know. There might have been 20 people there. I just couldn't imagine, with due respect, Billy, Bruce Springsteen doing that, if you know what I mean.
right.
So, it's a very different thing. He's got this, he seems to really, people want to befriend him. Other musicians, they want to hang out with him. And then when those projects, the Seven Worlds Collide and the other project with Wilco came up, I mean, you're right. People, why, he said, I've got the opportunity to offer you a trip to New Zealand, come and hang out and make a record and maybe do some shows. What do you think? It's all expenses paid. I mean, of course, they're going to say, hell yeah. Particularly, I remember with the Wilco record, the second record, it was Christmas time. And I'm thinking the guys in Wilco are sitting in Chicago in December.
Yeah.
Someone calls from the other side of the world and says, you want to come to New Zealand for a few weeks? What do you reckon? I don't think you'd have to think twice about it. But so, broadly speaking, I think he's well respected by his peers, but he's also really well liked. I think people just like hanging out with him, and I get the impression, having watched and spoken to people who are involved with these projects, he's a really good host, who has this great studio also in Auckland, one of the best studios in the country, and one of the best studios this side of the world, actually. So there was a lot of benefits. There's a lot of things going, and it would be almost an offer too good to refuse, I would think. And actually it'd be interesting to see whether there are future projects, because they did two. I often wonder, it's been quite a while since the Wilco project. I'm kind of hoping that there's something else. Oh, there's another factor too, surfing. Eddie Vedder and Neil and Tim got friendly surfing in New Zealand. There's a story that they took Eddie to, because a keen surfer, apparently, they took him out to a particular favourite spot, and he unfortunately got caught in a rip and he almost drowned.
No,
I think
geez.
they had they bonded over the fact that they saved him from being swept off to the South Pole somewhere.
Now, you said people like him. Like after writing this biography, like, do you have like fond feelings for Neil? As like are you able to kind of separate yourself from that as the author, or like do you find
Oh,
yourself
no, no,
kind of
no,
just
no.
like enchanted by
It's
this
all,
guy?
no, to me, it's just purely a respect for the guy's music and an interest in, how it all came together. I did actually want to call the book The Musical World of Neil Finn, because there isn't, it's funny, I just got reviewed in the UK and someone was complaining that there's not enough friction in the book. And the reality is there's not that much friction in his, there has been some, Problems with his brother Tim, obviously the loss of Paul Hester and so on. But it's not a psychodrama on the level of Fleetwood Mac, for instance. He's a pretty well-adjusted guy. He comes from a sensible middle-class New Zealand family. They're well-educated. His father was the local accountant. It's not like they were, Flea and Anthony. He's not like Flea and Anthony Kiedis from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, being brought up the children of drug dealers. It's nothing like that at all. So there isn't that sense of, drama and chaos in his story. But yeah, like I say, my attitude towards him is it's purely about his music. I'm just fascinated in the guy's music, and there's not a lot of personal stuff to talk about when it comes to Neil, because A, the songs are so good and so interesting to write about, and B, he's kept it on the straight and narrow pretty much.
Right.
He married when he was really young. He always wanted to have a family. And now found a way to, as an empty nester, to bring his kids back into his life by bringing them into Crowded House, and deservedly so too, it must be said. They're really accomplished musicians, and they fit. I saw them recently, and they just fit so perfectly within the band. So, he's a guy who seems to really have it together away from this career. So for a writer, there's not a lot of juice there.
Well, as far
really
friction goes, it really only seems like the Atlanta show for Crowded House is the only kind of real dust up.
Yeah, I mean, he had there's a funny story. Broad strokes. Neil was having problems with the third Crowded House record, came back to Australia after some sessions in America, did some recording with brother Tim. This is post, they hadn't recorded together for a long time. In fact, they'd never written together in the same room before. And these great songs fell out of them. Fall at Your Feet, Four Seasons in One Day, Weather With You, Chocolate Cake, all these great songs. And then they recorded them, and Neil decided to bring Tim into the band, which proved to be, a really bad idea. But he was just so excited about this new material. And of course, that all came to a head. You can't have two frontmen in a band when, they would swap songs. And when Tim wasn't performing his own songs, he'd be standing at the back of the stage playing the keyboards. He was a natural born frontman. And the funny situation, well, funny, not for them, of course, was they were playing in Byron Bay, which is sort of an Australian equivalent of, I always think it's like, I can imagine what San Francisco was like in the 60s. It's what they've tried to achieve in Byron Bay. It's up on the coast. It's it used to be a bit of a hippie hangout. It was the kind of place where you could go to get your, your chakra x-rayed and your kundalini aligned. It's that kind of place. And they were there, and it's all peace and mung beans, and they're playing this show, and things just went wrong on stage. It was a problem. Tim wasn't engaged. Neil was angry with him. And then later on, Neil took a swing at him backstage, because I think Tim described it as, a pathetic punch. And Neil ended up, locked inside the tour bus in the car park with some hippie banging on the door saying, "Neil, I can heal you. I can heal you." That was as close as it came to a huge blow up. Of course, what you're referring to is when Paul Hester decided to leave the band mid-tour, which was dramatic. And it was, a big moment in their career, and sort of changed a lot of things within the dynamic of the band. But even then, Neil handled it pretty well. He, I think they were touring with Sheryl Crow, and her drummer sat in with them for a few shows. And within a week, he had a new drummer in the band. So, he was, he's pretty good at handling those kind of situations. Again, like I say, it's not like Van Halen, it's not Fleetwood Mac. There's none of that drama there. This is a guy who really has a good handle on being as normal a person as he could be while living what most would see as a pretty, abnormal, surreal career. We can only dream of the kind of level of success that he's achieved, and the people he's met and the performances he's given. Not many normal people get to experience that, but he still maintained a pretty regular and fairly ordinary life away from the stage, which is, to me, is a huge achievement.
Well, we can only dream of that, but the book is called Don't Dream, It's Over. Jeff, thanks very much for taking some time to join me on the program to talk about it, and congratulations on the release of it.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.